A tense call to the police, a lively neighborhood party. When a woman's complaint sets off a chain of unexpected events, her quiet life is turned upside down. But what happens next will leave everyone, including her, utterly shocked. Are you ready to uncover the twist? The warm glow of a summer evening settled over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Mrs. Harrington, a woman in her mid-50s with a permanent crease of disapproval on her face, stood at her large living room window, peering out through the thin curtains. Her home, immaculate and precisely decorated, felt like a shell around her, a place where everything had a set place and purpose. Tonight, however, the normal quiet of her evening routine had been disrupted. Across the street, the Johnsons, her new black neighbors, were setting up for a party in their backyard, their laughter and the sound of upbeat music drifting toward her window. She tightened her lips and narrowed her eyes as she watched. To her, it felt like an invasion, a disruption in her neatly ordered world. Mrs. Harrington had only known the Johnsons in passing, catching brief glimpses of them from her window or exchanging short nods when she saw them in their front yard. They were polite but had never tried to engage in a conversation, and she had never felt the need either. But tonight, as she watched the guests arriving, her unease grew. She couldn't shake the thought that something was bound to go wrong. Inside, she paced around the living room, picking up small decorations and setting them back down without purpose. The music outside grew louder, laughter spilling into the air. She muttered under her breath about noise ordinances and peaceful neighborhoods, glancing now and then back at the party that continued without a care. Her irritation twisted into something sharper, something she hadn't wanted to admit even to herself, a feeling of discomfort that wasn't just about the noise. She picked up her phone and hesitated, staring down at it, wrestling with a decision. Part of her knew it was a leap, that calling the police would seem extreme, but another part of her clung to the notion of her right to peace and quiet. Her thumb hovered over the call button, and with a final push of self-assurance, she dialed 911. "Hello, police. Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance," she said, her voice laced with a tension that the operator picked up on. "It's my neighbors. They're having a loud party. Yes, it's been going on for a while now, and it's disturbing the peace." As she spoke, her gaze fell back to the party. She could see Mr. Johnson, a tall man with a gentle smile, chatting warmly with his guests, and Mrs. Johnson arranging food on a long table filled with dishes. They looked happy, at ease, as if nothing could break their joy that evening. But Mrs. Harrington's frustration boiled over, a silent anger mixed with something deeper, more complicated, that she couldn't quite put her finger on. When she ended the call, she let the curtain drop, pacing again with her phone gripped tightly in her hand. Moments passed, and Mrs. Harrington returned to her window, watching the scene outside with a mix of satisfaction and impatience. She felt a rush of vindication, convinced that her call would soon put an end to the disruption. But as she waited, her thoughts raced, flickering between annoyance and an unsettling feeling she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the music, she reasoned. It was the way the Johnsons seemed to fit in so comfortably, bringing warmth and laughter to a neighborhood she'd always viewed as her quiet sanctuary. Then in the distance she saw the faint blue and red lights of a police car bouncing off the houses. Her lips pressed into a thin line of approval as she watched the car pull up just outside the Johnsons' house. The music lowered. The partygoers' laughter softened and a hush fell over the gathering. The guests exchanged glances, their cheerful expressions replaced by ones of wary concern, and Mr. Johnson, visibly trying to keep calm, stepped forward to meet the officers. Mrs. Harrington watched closely, her eyes flicking between the officers and Mr. Johnson. One of the officers, a tall, calm-looking man, spoke to Mr. Johnson in a low voice. Mr. Johnson gestured toward the party with open hands, explaining something, his voice carrying a steady tone that Mrs. Harrington couldn't quite make out. She leaned closer to the window, her curiosity getting the better of her. At that moment, Mrs. Harrington caught sight of Mrs. Johnson, standing with her arms protectively around her young daughter, glancing toward her husband with worry. Some of the other guests looked around, a hint of fear and uncertainty flashing across their faces, especially those who were black. It was a look that held layers of worry, one that Mrs. Harrington barely noticed but should have. The officers nodded as Mr. Johnson continued speaking calmly, their expressions softening slightly. One of them even managed a small, understanding smile. Mrs. Harrington's brow furrowed as she watched. She'd expected a firm response, something that would make it clear the noise was unacceptable. But instead, the officers seemed almost friendly. Her fingers tapped impatiently on the windowsill, frustration building as she saw Mr. Johnson and the officers exchange a handshake. One of the officers then turned to face the house. Her heart skipped a beat as he looked directly in her direction, his gaze falling on her window. Instinctively, she stepped back, her heart thudding as she tried to remain unseen. She felt a prickling unease, the growing suspicion that her call wasn't having the intended impact. Slowly, cautiously, she edged forward again, just enough to peer through the curtains without being seen. To her dismay, the officers didn't disperse the party. Instead, they addressed the gathering in a calm, friendly tone that even she could hear through her open window. "Looks like everything's in order here, folks," one officer said with a reassuring smile. "Just keep the volume down a bit and you all have a good time." A murmur of relief rippled through the crowd, and a few of the guests chuckled, nodding in agreement. Mrs. Harrington clenched her jaw as she watched the officers turn and head back toward their car. They hadn't taken her seriously. They'd treated it like any other social call. She felt a surge of indignation, but it was quickly replaced by an unsettling twist in her stomach as Mr. Johnson looked over, his eyes scanning the surrounding houses. For a brief, tense moment, his gaze settled on her window, as if he knew exactly where the call had come from. Mrs. Harrington's heart pounded as she quickly pulled back from the window, hoping Mr. Johnson hadn't seen her. Her mind raced, torn between a sense of indignation and a creeping feeling of guilt she didn't want to acknowledge. She told herself she had every right to be frustrated. After all, it was her neighborhood too, and the noise was undeniably louder than usual. But despite her reasoning, she couldn't shake the uncomfortable weight pressing down on her. She sank into her armchair, staring blankly across the room, trying to refocus. Yet her thoughts kept drifting back to the scene outside, the police leaving without incident, the Johnsons and their guests resuming their laughter and conversation, their relief palpable. She clenched her jaw, annoyed by the image of their smiles, as though her complaint had barely made a ripple in their evening. Her gaze shifted to the phone on the side table, and for a fleeting moment, she considered calling the police again, maybe pressing harder this time. But just then, she heard footsteps outside, curiosity mixed with a simmering irritation as she got up and peered cautiously out the window. To her surprise, two of her other neighbors, the Williamses, a quiet couple she'd never seen at odds with anyone, were walking across the street toward the Johnsons' house, each carrying a dish of food. Mrs. Williams held a casserole, and Mr. Williams carried a tray of brownies. Mrs. Harrington's eyes narrowed as she watched the Johnsons welcome them with open arms, the neighbors exchanging warm greetings and joining in on the festivities as if they'd been invited all along. Her annoyance deepened. Why would they want to be part of this, she thought, feeling a pang of something she didn't quite understand. The Williamses were good, decent people who kept to themselves. She couldn't imagine what would compel them to join a party like this, a gathering that felt so different from their usual quiet lives. Yet, as she continued watching, she felt a tug of curiosity mingled with something sharper, something almost like jealousy. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Harrington stayed glued to her spot by the window, unable to pull herself away from the scene outside. She watched as more guests arrived, friends greeting one another warmly, laughter carrying easily through the night air. Occasionally, she'd see a familiar face, a neighbor she'd exchanged pleasantries with at the grocery store, another she'd sat near at community meetings. Each new arrival felt like a small betrayal, fueling a growing sense of isolation she couldn't quite place. Every so often, she caught herself leaning closer to the glass, listening intently, straining to catch bits of conversation or laughter, though she wouldn't have admitted to anyone that she was even paying attention. From time to time, she'd spot Mr. Johnson, calm and confident, moving through the crowd, offering drinks and checking in with guests, always with that easy smile. The sight of him being so at ease, so well-liked, grated on her. Suddenly, Mrs. Harrington's phone buzzed on the side table, pulling her out of her trance. She jumped, fumbling to pick it up. Glancing down at the screen, it was her friend, Linda. Mrs. Harrington felt a momentary flood of relief. Someone who would understand, someone who could validate her frustration. She quickly answered, her voice a low whisper as though the Johnsons might hear her. "Linda," she began, her tone edged with irritation. "You wouldn't believe what's going on tonight. It's like a circus across the street. The music, the noise, it's completely out of hand, and the police didn't even do anything." Linda sighed on the other end of the line, but it wasn't the sympathy Mrs. Harrington had expected. "Oh, Helen," Linda said, her voice soft but firm. "It's just a party. You know, they're new to the neighborhood. Maybe this is their way of celebrating, of bringing people together. Sometimes it's not so bad to let a little bit of noise in." Mrs. Harrington froze, her face tightening. She hadn't expected this response. "But it's not how we do things here," she stammered, her words coming out more defensively than she'd intended. But even as she spoke, she heard the echo of her own complaint, the hollowness of it, and it unsettled her in a way she hadn't felt before. Linda's pause lingered on the line before she spoke again, gently but directly. "Helen, maybe you should go over and see for yourself. It might not be what you're imagining." For a long moment, Mrs. Harrington didn't respond. Her grip on the phone tightened, her mind racing, unsure whether to dismiss Linda's words or take them to heart. Mrs. Harrington ended the call without responding, the suggestion lingering in her mind long after the line went dead. Go over there? The very idea made her bristle, yet the thought had already taken root, unsettling her even more. She told herself that Linda didn't understand, that she didn't know what it was like to have all that noise and commotion right outside her door. But deep down, a nagging feeling tugged at her, as if some small part of her knew that maybe, just maybe, Linda had a point. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. What would I even say if I went over there? She pictured herself crossing the street, standing awkwardly among the neighbors, with Mr. Johnson's warm, inviting eyes looking directly at her. The image made her chest tighten with a strange mixture of anxiety and shame. She pushed the feeling down, refusing to dwell on it. Just then, laughter erupted from the party, louder this time, drawing her attention back to the window. She could see Mrs. Johnson, her head thrown back in laughter, surrounded by friends who mirrored her joy. Even their young daughter was laughing, running in circles with other children, their shouts of glee filling the night. Mrs. Harrington's frown deepened. She had never once seen that level of joy in her own home, not since her husband passed years ago, leaving behind a silence that had grown more stifling with time. That brief moment of vulnerability caught her off guard, and she quickly closed the curtain, shutting herself off from the view. She moved back to her armchair, but instead of the usual sense of calm, she felt restless. The laughter from across the street still drifted through her closed window, faint but persistent, and for reasons she couldn't explain, it left her feeling more alone than ever. Minutes passed, and she found herself standing up again, wandering back toward the window, her resistance weakening. She opened the curtain just a crack, peeking through. She noticed Mr. Johnson again, this time standing with Mr. Williams, the quiet neighbor she'd always considered reliable and sensible. The two men were talking, deep in conversation, occasionally throwing their heads back with laughter. For a moment, Mrs. Harrington felt a pang of envy. She couldn't remember the last time she'd shared a laugh that genuine. Her hand lingered on the curtain and she bit her lip, her mind caught between resentment and curiosity. As the laughter continued to echo from across the street, Mrs. Harrington found herself pacing again, her thoughts tangled in a mix of annoyance, curiosity, and an uncomfortable loneliness she wasn't prepared to confront. She wanted to believe that her irritation was purely about the noise, about keeping the peace, as she had told herself, But deep down, her emotions were beginning to stir up things she hadn't faced in a long time. Suddenly, a soft knock at her front door broke through her thoughts. She froze, glancing toward the door with a mixture of suspicion and surprise. Who could that be at this hour? She wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment she wondered if the noise from the party had somehow attracted yet another, uninvited guest. Reluctantly, she moved toward the door, her hand resting on the doorknob as she hesitated, mentally preparing herself for what she might find. She took a steadying breath and opened it, only to find Mrs. Williams standing there, smiling softly, a covered dish in her hands. "Hi, Helen," Mrs. Williams greeted her warmly, as though they'd spoken just yesterday, though it had been months since they last exchanged more than a passing hello. "I thought I'd stop by and check on you. It's been a while." Mrs. Harrington was taken aback, momentarily at a loss for words. She forced a small smile, trying to mask her confusion. "Oh, thank you, Martha. That's very kind of you." Mrs. Williams held out the dish with a gentle smile. "I brought over some brownies, made an extra batch for the party, and I thought you might like some. Figured you might not want to come by, but, well, I didn't want you to feel left out." The words hit Mrs. Harrington unexpectedly, stirring a mixture of shame and gratitude. She glanced down at the dish, her fingers tightening around it as she searched for a response, struggling to ignore the unfamiliar warmth rising within her. "That's thoughtful of you," she managed to say, her voice softer than she'd intended. Mrs. Williams gave her a reassuring smile. "You know, Helen, it's just a party, and they're really good people. You might actually enjoy it if you gave it a chance." Mrs. Harrington's first instinct was to bristle, to dismiss the idea outright, but the kindness in Mrs. Williams' gaze softened her defenses. I don't know. It's just so different," she mumbled, unsure if she was even making sense. Mrs. Williams nodded, her eyes kind but perceptive. "Sometimes different isn't as scary as we think," she said gently. "You're welcome to join any time. They'd love to have you, I'm sure." With that, she gave Mrs. Harrington a warm squeeze on her shoulder, then turned to head back across the street, leaving Helen standing in her doorway, clutching the dish of brownies and feeling something she hadn't felt in years. A faint but undeniable pull toward something outside her familiar walls. Mrs. Harrington closed the door softly, the weight of Mrs. Williams's words settling around her like an unwelcome guest. She stared down at the brownies in her hands, feeling an odd mixture of warmth and irritation. It was such a small gesture, really. Just a neighborly offering, nothing more. Yet, somehow, it left her feeling exposed, as if Mrs. Williams had seen through her, past her defenses and into the loneliness she tried so hard to deny. She moved back into the kitchen and placed the dish on the counter, standing there a moment, staring at it. The sound of laughter still drifted in from outside, a gentle hum of voices and music that somehow felt different now, less intrusive. Instead, it had taken on a quality she could only describe as inviting. She couldn't deny that part of her wanted to join them, to step out of her solitude and into that circle of warmth and laughter. But the idea also filled her with resistance, a fear of losing control over the carefully constructed world she had built around herself. Almost unconsciously, she lifted the corner of the foil and took one of the brownies. She bit into it, the taste rich and sweet, and a memory surfaced, a long-forgotten moment from years ago when her husband had surprised her with a batch of homemade brownies after a particularly difficult day. The memory lingered, softening her as she realized how rare such gestures had become in her life, how long she had gone without any real connection. The pull to the window became irresistible, and she found herself there again, peering out with a strange sense of longing. The party had grown livelier, the guests more relaxed and carefree, sharing stories and laughter that carried easily on the summer breeze. She saw Mrs. Johnson, laughing with a friend as they poured lemonade for the children. Mr. Johnson was now talking with Mr. Williams, both men gesturing animatedly, as if sharing some amusing story. For the first time, Mrs. Harrington noticed how natural, How unguarded they all seemed, and she felt a pang of envy. Here they were, all gathered together, enjoying each other's company without pretense, while she stood alone, peering from the shadows of her own home. Her fingers rested on the edge of the window frame, and before she could talk herself out of it, she pushed the curtain aside, letting more light into the room. The light from the open curtain cast a gentle glow across the room, illuminating the corners that had grown dim over the years. Mrs. Harrington looked around, suddenly noticing the quiet in her own space. The stillness that once felt comforting now felt stifling. She swallowed hard, turning back to the window. The laughter and chatter from the Johnsons' yard seemed to seep into her home, filling the silence in a way that felt strangely comforting. Her mind drifted back to Linda's words. "Maybe you should go over and see for yourself," and Mrs. Williams' gentle nudge, "You're welcome to join any time." A flutter of nervousness rose in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. The thought of stepping outside, of joining a crowd she had judged so quickly, was daunting. But standing here, alone, watching others share in something so simple yet meaningful, felt even harder. She hesitated, fingers grazing her cardigan draped over the back of a chair. The cardigan felt familiar and safe, like a layer of armor. She slipped it on, clutching it tightly around her, as if it might shield her from the vulnerability of stepping into a space where she wasn't fully in control. A strange resolve stirred within her, a mixture of defiance and longing. Slowly, she opened the front door and stepped out onto her porch. The evening air was cool and carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the warm, inviting smell of grilled food from the Johnsons' yard. Her heart pounded as she took a tentative step forward, and then another, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground as she moved, half expecting someone to notice her approach, to question why she was there. But as she reached the edge of the Johnsons' yard, she realized that no one had even looked her way. Everyone was wrapped up in the warmth of their conversations, caught up in their own moments. Mrs. Johnson was busy refilling plates, Mrs. Williams was laughing with another neighbor, and the children were darting around, their laughter ringing out into the night. It was as though she was just another part of the neighborhood, another person welcomed in without question. Mrs. Harrington took a shaky breath and looked up, her eyes catching Mr. Johnson's from across the yard. He noticed her standing there, his expression shifting briefly to surprise, then softening into a warm smile. He raised a hand in a casual wave, a gesture that seemed to say, "You're welcome here, if you want to be." For a moment, Mrs. Harrington felt rooted to the spot, caught in Mr. Johnson's welcoming gaze. His smile was sincere, without a hint of judgment or resentment, just an open invitation. She gave a hesitant wave back, her hand barely lifting from her side, but it was enough for Mr. Johnson. He nodded, then gestured toward the table where the other guests had gathered, as if inviting her to join without a word. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. She wasn't used to being in situations like this, situations where she wasn't sure of her role, where she wasn't in control. She stood there, feeling exposed and awkward, fighting the urge to retreat back into her house. But then, Mrs. Johnson noticed her too, and with a bright, genuine smile, she began walking over, her arms open wide in a gesture of warmth and kindness. "Hi, Mrs. Harrington," she called out, her voice filled with surprise but also delight. "It's so nice to see you. I'm so glad you came over. We've been meaning to officially introduce ourselves." She stepped closer, her smile reassuring and open, making Mrs. Harrington feel unexpectedly at ease. Mrs. Harrington managed a small, stiff smile in return. "Oh, well, I just thought I'd come by for a moment." "I didn't want to intrude," she murmured, almost regretting her decision with each word. But Mrs. Johnson shook her head, waving away her hesitation. "Nonsense," she said, her eyes warm. "You're part of the neighborhood, and we're happy to have you here. Come on, let me introduce you to everyone." Before she could protest, Mrs. Johnson gently took her arm and led her into the circle of guests. The voices around her softened for a moment as the guests noticed her arrival. But to her surprise, there were no awkward glances, no questioning stares. Instead, The other neighbors greeted her warmly, welcoming her as though she had always been part of their gatherings. Mrs. Williams offered her a warm smile from across the circle, giving her a small, encouraging nod, while Mr. Williams handed her a glass of lemonade with a friendly wink. As Mrs. Harrington stood there, surrounded by her neighbors, she felt something inside her begin to thaw. A tiny crack in the wall she had built so carefully around herself. She took a sip of the lemonade, its sweetness unfamiliar yet refreshing, and felt the tension in her shoulders start to ease. The conversation flowed around her, laughter and stories shared effortlessly, and for the first time she felt herself genuinely wanting to listen, to understand these people she had kept at such a distance. She caught Mrs. Johnson's eye again, and they shared a brief, quiet smile. In that moment, Mrs. Harrington realized that maybe, just maybe, different didn't have to be unwelcome. The evening unfolded around Mrs. Harrington with an ease she hadn't felt in years. She found herself settling into a chair at the edge of the group, feeling both a part of it and comfortably on the sidelines. She sipped her lemonade, watching the children dart around the yard, their laughter filling the night air. Occasionally, she exchanged glances with Mrs. Johnson, whose warm, encouraging smile made her feel surprisingly at home. The conversations around her drifted from topic to topic, stories of shared struggles, memories from childhood, and jokes about life's little challenges. As she listened, she began to recognize a common thread. These people weren't so different from her. They worried about their families, laughed at the same kinds of jokes, and talked about the same small annoyances and joys she'd experienced herself. It dawned on her slowly, each revelation chipping away at her defenses. At one point, Mr. Johnson joined the circle near her, holding a plate piled high with barbecue and sides. He gave her a nod and gestured to the food table. "Mrs. Harrington, you have to try some of the food. Mrs. Williams made the potato salad, and it's famous around here." She felt her cheeks flush again, but there was something disarming about Mr. Johnson's genuine enthusiasm. She gave a small nod, setting her glass down and letting him guide her over to the spread of food. The table was laden with dishes, each one filling the air with mouth-watering scents. Hesitantly, she picked up a plate and served herself a modest portion of potato salad, feeling self-conscious, but trying not to show it. As she tasted it, the familiar flavors and textures brought back memories of past gatherings, of the kinds of community potlucks she used to attend before life had pulled her into her own isolated routine. She hadn't realized how much she missed moments like these, the simple act of sharing a meal with others, of feeling connected. Mr. Johnson noticed her quiet enjoyment and smiled. "Good, isn't it?" he asked, his tone friendly and without a hint of irony. "Mrs. Williams has a real gift in the kitchen. We're lucky to have her as our neighbor." Mrs. Harrington nodded, swallowing her bite, and managed a small smile. "It's very good," she admitted, her voice softer than usual. For the first time, she felt herself relax, letting her guard down just enough to feel at ease. As the evening continued, she found herself joining the conversations in small, unexpected ways. She laughed along with a joke Mr. Williams told, shared a nod of agreement with Mrs. Johnson over a comment about how fast children grow up, and even found herself telling a brief story from her own past, a fond memory of a family picnic she hadn't thought about in years. The group listened warmly, their attention and kindness weaving her into the fabric of the evening. And somewhere along the way, she realized the weight she had been carrying, the judgments, the discomfort, the loneliness had begun to lift, replaced by a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time: belonging. As the evening began to wind down, Mrs. Harrington found herself lingering, reluctant to leave the warmth and connection she had discovered so unexpectedly. She watched as people started to say their goodbyes, hugging and laughing as they gathered their things, reluctant to part from the company that had brought so much joy to the night. She could see Mr. and Mrs. Johnson moving among their guests, thanking everyone for coming, their faces glowing with contentment. Mrs. Harrington stood to the side, her plate now empty, holding her glass of lemonade in both hands, as if grounding herself in the moment. She hadn't felt so alive, so awake, in years. It was strange and wonderful, and she wasn't sure how to hold on to it. Yet she knew she wanted to. Just then, Mr. Johnson approached her, his smile as kind and open as it had been from the beginning. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Harrington. It was great to finally have a chance to get to know you," he said with sincerity, his eyes meeting hers. "I hope you enjoyed yourself." She nodded, a small but genuine smile forming on her face. "I did. I really did," she admitted softly. There was a pause as she considered her next words, feeling a surge of emotion that surprised her. I think I may have judged too quickly. About everything," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Johnson's face softened, and he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We've all done that at some point," he said kindly. "The important thing is that we're here now, right? And we're neighbors. That means a lot to us." Mrs. Harrington nodded, feeling the warmth of his words settle into her heart. She took a deep breath, the words coming before she could second-guess herself. "Thank you for welcoming me and for being so kind." She hesitated, then added, "I don't think I realized how much I needed this." Mr. Johnson gave her a knowing smile. "You're always welcome, Mrs. Harrington. Any time you feel like joining us, our door is open." She glanced around at the yard, now clearing out, the twinkling lights casting a soft glow over everything. For a moment, she didn't want to go back to her empty house, to the quiet that had once felt like a refuge but now felt hollow. She turned back to Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Johnson, who had joined them with her own warm smile, and she nodded with a sense of resolve she hadn't felt in years. Maybe next time I'll bring something of my own to share," she said, a little shyly. It was an offer that felt symbolic, a small step forward, a gesture of openness. Mrs. Johnson beamed, her smile lighting up her face. "We'd love that," she said, her voice gentle and welcoming. "We're looking forward to it already." As she made her way back across the street, the night air cool against her cheeks, Mrs. Harrington felt something inside her shift, a sense of peace and, perhaps, a glimmer of hope. She glanced back one last time at the Johnsons' yard, now almost empty, and saw Mrs. Johnson wave. She waved back, the simple gesture feeling like a promise, like a bridge that had finally been built across a divide she hadn't even realized was there. When she closed her front door behind her, the silence in her home felt different, not heavy or isolating, but calm and filled with possibility. She sat down in her chair by the window, but this time she didn't pull the curtains closed. Instead, she left them open, letting in the soft glow of the streetlights, her heart warmed by the thought that, just across the way, there was a place where she was welcome. In the days that followed, Mrs. Harrington found herself glancing toward the Johnsons' house more often, the memory of that warm evening replaying in her mind. Her daily routines felt subtly changed, softened by the knowledge that she was no longer quite as alone in her quiet corner of the neighborhood. She had become accustomed to her solitude, yet now, with that single evening opening a door she hadn't known existed, she felt a gentle anticipation for more. One afternoon, as she returned home from the market, she noticed Mrs. Williams in her front yard, pruning her rose bushes. With a slight hesitation, Mrs. Harrington raised her hand in a wave. Mrs. Williams looked up, surprised for a moment, before returning the wave with a broad, welcoming smile. Encouraged, Mrs. Harrington walked over, making small talk about the weather and commenting on the roses. For the first time in years, she found herself actually enjoying a casual conversation with a neighbor, the walls she had built around herself beginning to fade, brick by brick. Later that week, she spotted Mrs. Johnson outside, waving as she saw her. To Mrs. Harrington's own surprise, she walked over, a small basket in her hands filled with freshly baked muffins she had made that morning. "I thought you might like these," she said, her voice softer, a bit uncertain. Mrs. Johnson's eyes lit up, and she accepted the basket with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrington. "You didn't have to, but I'm so glad you did," she said warmly, her smile breaking down any remaining traces of doubt Mrs. Harrington had held. The small exchange left Mrs. Harrington feeling lighter, as though her steps had found a new rhythm, one no longer dictated by habits of isolation. And slowly, she began to make these gestures a part of her life, little acts of kindness that reached out across the neighborhood, softening boundaries she'd once thought necessary. One weekend, the Johnsons invited her to another gathering, and she arrived not as a reluctant guest, but with a covered dish in hand, her nerves replaced by a quiet confidence. She mingled easily, even sharing laughter with neighbors she'd once only nodded to in passing. She listened to their stories, shared a few of her own, and felt herself becoming part of the pulse of the community. As the months passed, Mrs. Harrington looked back on that summer evening, realizing it had marked a change in her life that was both simple and profound. The Johnsons, with their warmth and willingness to embrace her, had given her the chance to rediscover a part of herself she'd long buried, a side that longed for connection, for laughter, for companionship. Her days no longer felt like they belonged only to her. They were woven into the fabric of her neighborhood, each day bringing a new thread of friendship and understanding. The open curtains in her home became a daily reminder of that evening, of the decision to step out of her solitude and into a life that welcomed others. She had discovered that life didn't have to be as small and isolated as she had made it. It could be as vast and colorful as she allowed it to be. And as she looked out each day, she felt grateful for the neighbors who had shown her that simple truth, reminding her that it was never too late to start over, to reach out, and to let light in. As time went on, Mrs. Harrington's life continued to open up in ways she'd once thought unimaginable. She began to embrace small but meaningful changes, finding herself more comfortable with her neighbors, more willing to join in, and even host the occasional gathering. Her once closed door was now a familiar sight to those passing by, often open with the smell of fresh-baked goods wafting from the kitchen. One morning, as she sat on her front porch enjoying her coffee, she saw Mr. Johnson jogging by, waving and calling out a cheerful, "Good morning, Mrs. Harrington." She waved back, smiling easily, and felt the warmth of friendship spread through her. Across the street, Mrs. Williams worked in her garden, and with a newfound spontaneity, Mrs. Harrington walked over, offering to help with the weeding. They laughed together, sharing stories of their past, finding that they had more in common than either of them had realized. In the evenings, she would occasionally join the neighborhood's small gatherings around a fire pit in the Johnsons' backyard, watching as the children played, sharing in the conversations that flowed as naturally as the laughter. Her stories became part of the neighborhood's shared memory, moments of kindness, resilience, and even vulnerability that made her feel more at home than she ever had before. One day, the Johnsons invited her over for a Sunday dinner, a tradition they held dear. She felt honored, touched by their gesture, and arrived with a pie she had baked herself, just like she used to for family gatherings long ago. That evening, as she sat around their table surrounded by the warm voices of friends and neighbors, Mrs. Harrington felt a profound sense of belonging. The laughter, the shared meal, the quiet understanding between each person. It was a kind of family, a community she had once believed she didn't need. As the years passed, Mrs. Harrington grew into her new life. Her house no longer a place of solitude, but a welcome stop for neighbors dropping by to share news, laughter, or just a friendly chat. Her days felt filled in a way she hadn't thought possible. The walls she had built around her heart were gone, replaced by open doors, welcoming smiles, and a life enriched by connection. Reflecting back on that fateful evening when she had made the call to the police, she couldn't help but smile at how much had changed. The Johnsons' kindness had been the first step, and in the warmth of their acceptance, she had found herself again. She had learned that life, even at its quietest, could be filled with love, laughter, and friendship, as long as she kept her heart open. In the end, Mrs. Harrington discovered that she hadn't just gained new friends. She had become part of a family. And as she looked out her window each day, The view of her neighborhood was no longer just familiar. It was home. As the seasons changed, so did Mrs. Harrington, embracing her place in the neighborhood fully and joyfully. Winter came, bringing the first snowfall of the year, and she found herself eagerly participating in the neighborhood's holiday traditions. For the first time, she joined the local caroling group, bundled up in a cozy scarf as she walked door to door, singing alongside her neighbors and marveling at how life had turned out. When they reached the Johnsons' house, Mr. Johnson opened the door with his usual bright smile. His family gathered around, clapping and laughing along with the carolers. Mrs. Harrington noticed their daughter, who had grown taller over the year, now looking at her with a sense of familiarity and affection. She waved, and the girl waved back, a small but meaningful gesture that filled Mrs. Harrington with a warm, undeniable joy. As the carolers moved on to the next house, Mrs. Johnson stopped her. "Would you come in for a cup of hot cocoa?" she asked, her voice hopeful, as if this had become their quiet tradition. Mrs. Harrington nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. Inside, she joined the Johnson family around their Christmas tree, decorated with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn. She laughed as Mrs. Johnson told stories about the family's holiday mishaps, feeling herself swept into their joy. One evening, as spring approached, the Johnsons invited her to a community meeting where neighbors shared ideas for improving their neighborhood. Mrs. Harrington found herself surprisingly excited to contribute, suggesting the addition of a community garden. Her idea was met with enthusiasm, and before she knew it, she was organizing a planting day with her neighbors, digging in the soil and planting seeds alongside children and families alike. When the garden bloomed, bursting with color and life, she felt a deep sense of pride and accomplishment, knowing she had brought something beautiful to the neighborhood she once kept at arm's length. Over time, Mrs. Harrington's house became known as a warm, welcoming stop on the block. Neighbors stopped by to share recipes, borrow gardening tools, or simply chat on her porch over tea. She found herself offering advice to young parents, sharing her wisdom with the same gentle compassion she had once guarded so carefully. Her home had transformed, just as she had, from a place of isolation to a cornerstone of the community. Years later, as she looked out her window onto the vibrant street below, Mrs. Harrington felt a profound sense of peace. She had become someone she'd never expected to be, a friend, a mentor, a beloved neighbor. Her journey had shown her that connection could be found at any age, that love could grow in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes a single act of kindness could change everything. With a smile, she watched as the neighborhood children played in the garden she'd helped create, their laughter ringing out in the warm afternoon air. And as she gazed out at the people she now considered family, Mrs. Harrington felt a deep and lasting gratitude for the life she had found, one she hadn't realized she'd been searching for all along. As the years rolled on, Mrs. Harrington became a fixture in the community. She organized annual potlucks in her garden, a beloved event where neighbors gathered with their favorite dishes, setting up tables beneath strings of lights that turned her yard into a welcoming oasis. She looked forward to the event each year, feeling a renewed sense of purpose as she watched friendships blossom and children grow up right before her eyes. One spring, as the potluck season approached, Mrs. Harrington had an idea. She reached out to Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Williams with a suggestion that surprised even herself. "What if we start a neighborhood tradition where everyone shares a story?" Her voice was tentative, not wanting to intrude, but her neighbors responded with immediate enthusiasm. Soon, word spread that this year's potluck would be centered around story night. When the evening of the potluck arrived, Mrs. Harrington stood in her garden, watching as neighbors gathered, some carrying dishes, others eagerly chatting about what stories they'd share. The event kicked off with laughter and warmth, the air filled with scents of homemade casseroles, grilled vegetables, and pies. As twilight settled in, one by one, people began to share their stories, small, heartfelt moments from their lives that had shaped them. The stories varied from funny and heartwarming to poignant and reflective, and each one was met with applause and appreciation. When it was Mrs. Harrington's turn, she felt a flutter of nerves, but she stood up, meeting the eyes of her friends and neighbors. She took a breath, her heart full, and began sharing the story of that first night, the night she had called the police on a party across the street, thinking it was nothing more than a disturbance. She recounted her perspective back then, her misconceptions, and her journey from skepticism to friendship. She spoke about how that one night had changed her life, about how she had found family in the people she once kept at a distance. Her voice softened as she reached the end. If it hadn't been for the Johnsons' kindness, for Martha's gentle nudge to give this neighborhood a chance, well, I don't know where I'd be today, she said, her eyes glistening with tears. But I'm grateful, truly grateful that you all became my family. You made this place a home in a way I never expected. The crowd was silent for a moment, touched by her words. Then, applause broke out, a sound filled with warmth and understanding, as if each clap held a memory of their shared lives, of the kindnesses exchanged over the years. Mr. Johnson stepped forward, giving her a hug, and one by one, the neighbors followed, each one embracing her with gratitude for the woman she had become. That night, under the starlit sky, Mrs. Harrington sat surrounded by her neighbors, her family, her heart fuller than it had ever been. She realized, finally, that sometimes life has a way of surprising us, leading us to the people and places we're meant to cherish. And as she looked around at her garden, filled with laughter, light, and love, Mrs. Harrington knew she had found her forever home, not just in a place, but in the people who had opened her heart in ways she had never imagined. As the potluck wound down, Mrs. Harrington lingered in her garden, savoring the quiet hum of conversation and the glow of lights fading into the night. She watched her neighbors helping each other pack up, laughing as they shared the last of the desserts, children drifting off to sleep on their parents' shoulders. For the first time in years, Mrs. Harrington felt entirely at peace, knowing she was surrounded by people who saw her, who knew her, and who valued her as much as she valued them. As she gathered a few stray plates and cups, Mr. Johnson approached her with a gentle smile. "Mrs. Harrington," he said softly, "thank you for tonight. You know, you've brought so much to this neighborhood. I can't imagine it without you." His words touched her deeply, filling her with a warmth that settled like a gentle glow in her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I never imagined my life could be like this. I owe so much of it to you, and to everyone here." He chuckled and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes the people we least expect can change our lives the most," he said. "And I think you've done that for all of us too." As the last few neighbors trickled out, Mrs. Harrington walked them to her garden gate, exchanging final hugs and goodbyes. The night air was crisp, and the stars sparkled above, illuminating the garden with a soft glow. She stood there alone for a moment, looking out over her yard, which now bore the remnants of a gathering that had brought her so much joy. With a sigh of contentment, she turned to go back inside. She left her porch light on, leaving the door open for a bit longer than usual, feeling that this openness symbolized her life now, a life no longer defined by walls or boundaries, but by the friendships and love that had filled every corner of her heart. As she finally closed the door, Mrs. Harrington smiled to herself, knowing that she would wake up tomorrow and every day after, surrounded by the family she had once thought she didn't need. She understood now that it wasn't just a neighborhood. It was home, filled with the people who had taught her, quite unexpectedly, that life was always richer when shared, and she, in turn, had shared herself in ways she never thought possible, leaving an indelible mark on the hearts of those she now called her own. In the days that followed, Mrs. Harrington felt the warmth of that evening linger with her, a quiet, reassuring presence that seemed to echo in the walls of her once solitary home. She found herself smiling at little things, the morning light streaming through her open curtains, the sound of children laughing as they played nearby, the friendly waves of neighbors passing by her window. She no longer hurried to close the curtains or retreat into herself. Instead, She welcomed the moments of connection, no matter how small. One morning, as she was tending to her garden, planting flowers she'd chosen with care, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. She looked up to see Mrs. Johnson and her daughter standing at the gate, the young girl holding a small pot with a delicate seedling peeking out. "We thought you might like this for your garden," Mrs. Johnson said with a smile, handing over the pot. "My daughter picked it out. She says it's her favorite." Mrs. Harrington knelt down to be eye level with the girl, who held out the pot with both hands, her face lit up with pride. "Thank you," Mrs. Harrington said warmly, taking the small plant. "It's beautiful. I'll plant it right here where everyone can see it." Together, the three of them found a spot, and Mrs. Harrington gently placed the plant into the soil, patting it down and giving it a careful sprinkle of water. As they worked, Mrs. Johnson shared stories about her daughter's love for gardening, and Mrs. Harrington found herself laughing, swept up in the joy of the moment. As the little girl ran off to play, Mrs. Johnson lingered, her gaze thoughtful as she looked at Mrs. Harrington. "You've become such an important part of all our lives," she said quietly. "I can't tell you how grateful I am for that night. I think it changed all of us." Mrs. Harrington felt a lump rise in her throat, a mix of gratitude and something she could only describe as love. "It changed me too," she replied, her voice soft. "More than I ever thought possible." They shared a smile, one that spoke of friendship, resilience, and the simple beauty of lives intertwined. Mrs. Johnson reached out, giving Mrs. Harrington's hand a gentle squeeze before turning to join her daughter. As Mrs. Harrington stood in her garden, looking at the small seedling now part of her own, she understood that life had indeed taken a turn she'd never expected. She felt deeply rooted, not just in her home, but in the hearts of those around her. And as the seasons continued to change, Mrs. Harrington knew she would grow right alongside the little seedling, nurtured by the love and warmth of the community she now cherished. The past, with all its loneliness, was just that, past, and the future, bright and welcoming, lay ahead, filled with friendship, laughter, and a garden that would continue to flourish, as she had, in the light of newfound family. As the years passed, Mrs. Harrington's life became woven deeply into the fabric of the neighborhood. Her garden, once a solitary patch, had blossomed into a shared space of life and color. Neighbors would drop by, often with seedlings, tools, or simply a story to share, each adding to the growing legacy of the space. The little seedling given by Mrs. Johnson's daughter had grown into a vibrant, flowering bush, a symbol of how something small, when nurtured with care, could transform into something truly beautiful. Each season brought with it new memories. In the summer, children would gather in her yard, helping her plant vegetables, learning the joy of watching something grow from soil and sun. In the autumn, she hosted a pumpkin carving event, her garden becoming a bright display of lanterns made by little hands and joyful hearts. Winter meant holiday lights and hot cocoa on her porch, and Mrs. Harrington became known as Miss Helen to the children, who saw her as family, a welcoming figure they could count on. One day, as she prepared for yet another potluck gathering, she felt a familiar pang of gratitude as she looked at her now full kitchen table, laden with homemade dishes, some of them recipes she'd learned from her neighbors. She felt a calm joy settle within her, a gratitude for the life she had built, the love she had received, and the friendships she cherished. That evening, as friends filled her home and laughter spilled out into the cool night air, Mrs. Harrington took a quiet moment for herself, stepping into her garden and looking up at the stars. She remembered that first night, the feelings of resentment, judgment, and isolation that had once felt so strong. She remembered the walls she'd put up, thinking they kept her safe, but realizing now they had only kept her alone. Those walls had been replaced by something far richer, the connections she had once feared, connections that had now become her greatest treasures. As she looked around her garden, filled with the laughter and warmth of her friends, she knew that this life, this unexpected, beautiful life, was her own. It was a life she had opened her heart to, a life she had chosen, day by day, gesture by gesture, and one that had grown fuller and more meaningful with every season. Mrs. Harrington took a deep breath, the scent of flowers and freshly turned soil filling her senses, and she smiled, feeling a deep peace settle over her. She was home, truly home, surrounded by family in every sense of the word. And as she stepped back inside to join her friends, her heart was light, her spirit content, knowing that she had created a life not just worth living, but one that was full, shared, and forever intertwined with the people she loved. As the years continued to pass, Mrs. Harrington's life became a gentle legacy in the neighborhood, her home a cornerstone of community and kindness. Children who had once learned to garden in her yard grew up, visiting her often, bringing their own children to meet Miss Helen and hear her stories. The garden, vibrant and lush, was filled with plants and flowers from nearly every neighbor, a collection of colors and scents, each one a memory of a friendship, a shared moment, a kindness given or received. On a warm spring evening, as the neighborhood gathered once again in her yard for the annual potluck, Mrs. Harrington sat at her favorite spot, a comfortable chair by the flowering bush that had once been a tiny seedling. She listened as her friends and neighbors laughed, sharing stories old and new, and felt the familiar, steady warmth of belonging wrap around her. As dusk fell and the sky turned a deep, soft blue, Mrs. Johnson's daughter, now a young woman, came and sat beside her, holding her hand gently. "Miss Helen," she began, her voice tender, "I just wanted to thank you for everything. You've taught me so much about what it means to be part of something bigger than myself." Mrs. Harrington's eyes sparkled as she squeezed the young woman's hand. "Oh, my dear, you all taught me that," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I didn't need anyone, but I was wrong. Life is meant to be shared. It's so much richer that way." A gentle hush fell over the gathering as more neighbors turned to listen, the night air filled with a sense of reverence and love. Someone raised a glass and soon everyone followed, lifting their glasses in tribute. "To Helen," Mr. Johnson said, his voice carrying warmth and gratitude, "for bringing us all together, for opening her heart, and for showing us what it means to be family." Tears welled in Mrs. Harrington's eyes as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, each one so dear to her now, each one a part of her story. She raised her own glass, her heart full. "To all of you," she said, her voice steady, "for being my family, my friends, and my home. You have all given me more than I could ever have dreamed." As they toasted and laughter filled the night, Mrs. Harrington sat back, her heart at peace, knowing she had created a legacy of love, kindness, and community. She felt content, knowing that no matter where life took her neighbors, her friends, her family, they would carry this sense of belonging with them. Her heart, her life, her home had been forever changed, woven into the fabric of a neighborhood she loved. And in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she was right where she was meant to be. Mrs. Harrington's journey shows that it's never too late to open our hearts and find family where we least expect it. If you're moved by this story of transformation and community, share it and spread the message that kindness and connection can change lives. Did you enjoy this story of change and new friendships? Please like and subscribe to see more heartwarming stories about kindness and community. Stay tuned for more.